Welcome, everyone. We are very happy to have Nancy Baker back to give us our fourth presentation. She did one on the American Depression, the art of the Harlem Renaissance, and the nativity in Western art. And today she's going to talk about You Are What You Eat, how pictures of food, reveal a culture. And Nancy is a member of the UU Church in Milford, New Hampshire. And she has given lectures at lots of places, churches, education programs, senior centers, community groups. And as I just said, this is her fourth to us. So she's very knowledgeable about art and art as it connects to history and location. Oh, good. Get some more people. So anyway, thank you so much for coming again, Nancy, and we will enjoy this.
Okay, let me share my screen with you. So hopefully you all can see that. Oops, we need to go back one. So what you're seeing here is a Giuseppe Arcambolo. He's a 16th century Italian painter who did portraits out of food. And this one happens to be summer. So he did one for each season that reflected what was growing in that time that you could eat. So today we're going to take a look at what we eat. And you know, it's not going to be all sustainable food here because art hasn't caught up with that, but it's about the people who eat food and paint food. And it's sort of, think of it as a little art history class focused on food and art over time. So many surviving Roman floor mosaics depict fallen table scraps, okay? Now, the Hellenistic Greeks and Etruscans believed that you didn't pick up what fell on the floor for a while because you wanted to give people who had used to eat with you who had passed away a chance to have a nibble. But it's a way of doing the floor, and then nobody worries if you haven't swept it, you know, instantly after dinner is over. So the mouse here, you can see, is in it in the lower right, eyeing the nut. And what you're noticing about the diet here is that the Romans ate a pretty healthy diet of fish and fruits and nuts. And of course, it lays the foundation for the Mediterranean diet that many of us pursue today. So Flemish painting is where food comes into its own in the 17th century. So this is a Flemish painter known for all kinds of types of paintings, portraits and genre scenes, but he was especially known for kitchen scenes. And what you have here is food preparation in the kitchen. You can see that she has enough to serve a 6-course meal here. She just has to prepare it. And she has an eager sort of suitor, right, who's offering her something else. You can see he's offering her a coin, right? However, they have a witness to all of this who's eyeing the food. And that's where it shows you how the light is coming into the painting from the left and catching the little boy's curly hair on the left side of his face, and also the bun that's up on the top that provides some light contrast here. And most of the food groups are captured here. But she's probably not going to give herself to the suitor in front of the boy, of course. So it does tell us a lot about what the Dutch ate. And obviously they ate a lot of protein. And expect in many of the paintings you're going to see cabbage because it is so paintable. So this is another, this is Franz Snijders, and he's best known for scenes of this kind, which depict food about to be prepared in great quantities. But he was also a painter who was picked by painters who were even more famous, like Peter Paul Rubens, to do any of the animal motifs that were included in a Rubens painting. Rubens didn't paint them necessarily. He would hire an experienced animal painter like Schneider's to do that. And you can see he's very good at it, particularly look at, the rabbit and the deer in this painting. So a maidservant is carrying a tray of quail that has also a pheasant on it. And she's looking along all the things that she has to choose from to prepare a meal, either in the home where she works, or perhaps it's even, a tavern or a place that serves meals, right? So Dutch still life, which this is, often has what you call trompe-l'oeil effects. And the place you see it the most is where you have light shadow contrast, but you're trying to get the viewer to see this food as though it's right on top of them. And one way to do that is to have the food hang over the edge of a table or a shelf or something like that. So if you look at the lobster in this picture, you can see that all she'd have to do is bump the shelf and the plate with the lobster would be over the side. And you notice that the poor deer, the same thing, partly on, partly off. And this is a definite technique. And it also allows you to show, if you look under the platter where the lobster is, the shadow there adds contrast to the light. So you're looking at all kinds of things. And just look at the food you've got here. The salmon steaks, I mean, it's meat, it's fish, it's seafood. And of course, the cat is very interested in the eels that are in the tray on the bottom here. But then in the middle of it, you've got this little mini still life of the fruit in the basket. It's just beautifully well done. It's almost too much for your eye to see. So you have to take it in little sections, like you have a still life in the lower right also. So the focus of it, of course, is the dead swan that's white in the middle. Right? And then if you look at every place that's white in this painting, you see how he's moving your eye all the way around the painting. Now, this one is a very naughty painting. It's, if you would say so, erratic fruit and vegetables, right? So you've got a rather saucy looking woman here, and she's holding a head of cabbage here, right? Now, maybe you didn't know it, and you won't be able to go to the market basket after this without thinking about it, I'm sure. But for the Dutch in this period, the cabbage is a symbol of female sexuality. And so she's offering you a lot, not only a cabbage, right? And then the man, what is he holding, right? A carrot. So I'll leave you to figure that one out too, right? And then you can see all of the vegetables, again, are pushed right in your face, right? Looking very much up close. But look at the color and the texture of all of this. Some of the fruit and vegetables are outsized. The parsnips are too big, right, for example, but it doesn't matter. He's showing off talent here, and it's beautifully well organized to do that. But notice also where the woman's got her elbow on the shelf. Why is the painter doing that? So that there's shadow, right? And the shadow is drawing your eye there against the light and then pushes it right down toward the cabbage, which she's offering to you. This is Max Lieberman, and he once said that a well-painted carrot was just as good as a well-painted Madonna. Now, not everyone would agree with him, but in the third quarter of the 19th century, a lot of advances were made in still life painting by painters who worked in other genres too. So Lieberman is a painter who is sort of a forerunner of what became Germanic Impressionism. So he's very interested in light and color effects, and he does it very well. And you probably never heard of him, but he's a very fine painter. And, it's him in the painting. He puts himself in it in the chef's cap. And notice what he's picked. Remember, I told you, you want to look for cabbages. and see how well done that cabbage is, right? And the carrots as well. And it's more than anything, what's really well done is the copper basin on the left, which is reflecting the light that he's so interested in. There's not a lot in the background here. It's all, again, pushed to the foreground, emphasizing color and light. The basket is really well done foil to the copper basin. Now, we're going to work our way now through the menu from drinks and appetizers to dessert. Okay, so this work actually is something of a portrait because it has several members of what are called the Skagen painters. They were a group of Danish and Norwegian and Swedish painters who they formed a small community on the tip of the northern tip of the Jutland Peninsula in the 1880s, and they painted together. I mean, it was an art colony. So this is a typical of what we're going to see as we work through the menu. There are all of these painters, and they are they're a combination of what the French Impressionists are trying to do and the Naturalists are trying to do. Naturalists want to portray nature as it is, but not in such a realistic way that it's overpowering, but it is natural. So if you look, for example, at the branch at the top right of the picture, you can see it's very natural, but it still can have that impressionistic quality and reflect light. Look at the brushwork and the texture. And the best thing to look at in this painting is the color yellow, because it's where the light is in the painting, right? And it moves your eye, right? And if you look at this, a painter you almost certainly don't know, and I say to you, Renoir, you go, yes, right? Now, here is, in fact, a Renoir. And it's typical of his brushwork, right? So without being too detailed about the bread, you get a sense of its crunchy crust and chewy interior. And the yellow is very subtle here, but look at everywhere that it is. So wonderful brushwork. It's simple, but it's more than that. Now, this is an American painter. He's still alive. He, I think, is 93 or 4 now. And he's very famous for painting the commonplace, especially food, and especially desserts. We're going to see him again for dessert. And he doesn't like to be called a pop artist, but that's where he gets grouped. Okay. But he's really more a still life painter than a pop artist. And it's just the way he presents it. Everything is very tactile, very geometric, and extremely organized, almost over-organized in his painting. But on the other hand, you never knew that celery had such potential here as a rounded rectangle. So there is something very American about this. It's almost that American optimism and nostalgia for the familiar. If this were French, a plate of appetizers, it wouldn't look like that, is what I'm saying. How many potlucks have you been to where you've seen this? So now to go to the great still life painters were the 17th century Dutch. Dutch Baroque still life painting is the greatest, and it's all about food. So look at this painting and what I told you about the trompe-l'oeil effect, where the dishes hang over the edge of the table. I mean, this is impossible the way they're hanging on this table. But again, it really invites you in, and it's wonderful light, dark contrast. And these painters were renowned for being able to do reflections in shiny objects or in water, right? So looking here, what they want you to look at is not just the food, especially they want you to look at the glassware and the pewter here. And so what you're seeing is a pewter plate with opened oysters. And it's all against a background that offers you nothing. So you have to focus on what you're given here, right? It's Dutch realism, but it contains a hidden message, like almost all their still life do. So you see the glass with the wine in it. This is what's called a romer, R-O-E-M-E-R, and they're in a lot of the paintings because it's interesting texture. And you then, with the half full glass, you get a chance to do the reflection in it. And they all wanted to show off their skills doing that. But it's symbolizing moderation. Most of these paintings are what you call a vanitas. They're not necessarily about, enjoy today because you're not going to be here tomorrow. They're about, let's moderate what we eat so that we don't get heart disease, except they didn't know that, of course. But it's the same thing. It's don't overdo anything in your life. You need to have kind of the moderated middle ground. And this is food showing you that. Now, in the 17th century, oysters were an inexpensive seafood. And they're often associated with brothels and intemperance. So Haida here is basically giving you a warning, look where intemperance leads. And you'll notice in many of the paintings, because lemons were an import, it's exotic, it's expensive. So peeling it, so many of these still lifes do exactly this with the lemon. They're showing you the interior, but the exterior, and then they have the peel dropping down over the edge in the trompe-l'oeil effect. Now, she's one of my favorite painters of all time, Clara Peters, and she did still life. And so what you have here is a wooden table, and you've got a couple of boiled crabs and some shrimp and freshwater fish, right? Carp, that kind of thing, maybe a northern pike on the plate. And you see the goblet again, but notice it's the light reflection. And all of her paintings have this rhythmic kind of contrast between rounded and jagged shapes. Like, look at the colander, right? And then the artichoke. They're opposite in almost every way. They're complementary colors. Their textures are very different, but she gets you to look at both of them. That's her genius as a painter. This happens to be the earliest dated fish still life ever known. And of course, fish was very common food in the Netherlands. They live on the sea, right? And they have a lot of rivers and creeks and ponds, which also had a lot of fish. And up until the 16th century, of course, the people in Holland were good Catholics. So Lent, meant that there was a period of time when you didn't eat meat. And so you continued to eat a lot of fish, right? This is Goya, the famous Spanish painter. And he always tries to get at the truth of things. So he's showing you the truth of the salmon here. It's a very banal subject matter, right? He's not offering you anything but 3 salmon steaks, right? But he gives those salmon steaks kind of a quiet nobility, a dignity, that they wouldn't have if anything else was with them. So he really is the most important Spanish artist of the late 18th and early 19th century. And he is not especially well known for doing still life, but he did a number of them. And, basically, he's doing color, he's doing red against a completely black background. And then it's the light. The way the light hits the salmon steaks right in the middle is just wonderful. This is Van Gogh. This is still life with mussels and shrimp, and it's about color, right? It's exuberant. He's a post-impressionist painter, of course, as you probably know. And many of his paintings are characterized by color contrast. And here you see it with the reds against the whites and blacks. But what you want to look at in this painting, which is characteristic of Van Gogh, in this particular time, he's just emerging when he paints this from his, nobody would want to buy it, period. Of the mid 1880s, actually, I'm going to show you one more of them, which were pretty typical and pretty dreary. In 86, he's moving more toward the Van Gogh you would know, which is going to have a lot of yellow and a lot of blue in it. But here, he's already changed for brushwork. So it's the saturated color and the brushwork that you want to look at. This is a Vermeer. I'm sure you recognize it. Now, this is a milkmaid. So what a milkmaid was in the 17th century in Holland, where they had a lot of cows, was a dairy servant, right, who produced butter and cheese, and generally in a room that was separate from the house, which could be cool, and, you know, probably somewhere out near the stables, right? And then gradually over time, the milkmaid began to work more in the house in a food preparation. So this is in that kind of stage. It's in between. You've got a young, rather sturdily built woman, and she's wearing a crisp linen cap and a blue apron. And, you know, her work sleeves are pushed up. And, you know, you really sort of look at this common woman in her, you know, common place. And what she's got for you is milk and bread here. And, you know, she's just kind of doing her job. And it's the typical brilliance of Vermeer, with the light coming in from the left. But you want to look closely at this painting because there's more there. You're drawn to the milkmaid and you're drawn to the still life on the table. But that's not necessarily the complete genius of Vermeer. Notice that the wall in the background is, as would be a place where dairy products are prepared, very plain wall in the background. It's full of light. It's got a foot warmer on the floor, right? You can see the little tiles along the bottom. But what draws your eye in this are two things. One, her bodice is lead tin yellow, and he's paired it with ultramarine, which was at the time the most expensive paint you could produce. The pigment is made from lapis lazuli, which comes from Afghanistan. And many of Vermeer's contemporaries went to azurite, which was not quite as saturated a blue as ultramarine, because they couldn't afford to get the materials to grind the pigment. But Vermeer insisted on it, and you can see what a difference it's made. He's doing what Van Gogh will do, which is putting blue, saturated blue, against yellow, and it makes both colors pop. And then what it does, he's doing the same thing on the table, you see it, with the food. This is another Clara Peters. I just love her paintings. And she painted almost all food. So she's fascinated with the fall of light on objects like coins or goblets or pewter dishes and whatever. So you can see here what she is really well known for is being able to paint naturalistic texture. So, I mean, your mouth waters when you look at that. And a lot of it has to do with the way that she can convey how it tastes as well as how it looks, right? And many of these things were imported for the Dutch, but remember, they traded all over. And so they were able to bring things back. So if you're wondering what the object is next to the pie in the center that's on the left side of the painting, that's a salt cellar. And so a very expensive salt cellar with extremely expensive salt in that. They, even though they lived on the sea, the Dutch couldn't, make enough salt for themselves. So just look at the texture and the way she moves it. So there's a difference here. Look at the puffiness of the bun on the plate, and then you get to see its reflection. Incredibly well done. Okay, so If what she's doing here is using texture and color and shape to move your eye around this painting. It's just stunning. So what we want to do is start with the picture that has the long pouring spout, which is extremely well done. Look at the detail in that, right? And how much light reflection it gets. But with the spout, your eye goes immediately to the taza next to it, which doesn't have anything in it. But look at the detail. And then it gives you the same height, but not quite as high. So it's drawing your eye down to the salt cellar, right? And then your eye goes to the orange, which of course would be an import. They don't grow in Holland, or they didn't in the 17th century. And then to the bun, right? And then over using the knife to the olives, and look at the wonderful reflective, they look so juicy. And then finally back over to the fowl in the dish, it's pheasant, right? And look at the skin on it, incredible. But the pièce de résistance to this wonderful painting is the pie in the middle. So it's only in the 17th century that pies, and this would have been a meat or a fish pie, not a fruit pie, almost certainly. And only in this time did they get a top crust. Other than that, and look what she's done with the top crust. It looks like it came right out of the oven, so realistically. Remember this woman, she's a fabulous painter. And here she is again. This is cheese, right? Really makes you want to eat cheese and artichokes. And notice it's the same salt cellar, right? So it again, look at the texture, where she's put the color, all the reflections that she's doing here. You can see every knife mark in the butter on the top, every place that a piece of cheese has been cut off here. And it's different cheeses too, right? Now, why is she going to paint so much cheese and butter? Well, because you're not supposed to eat them during Lent, right? But on the other hand, they make for great painting. You can look at it maybe, but not eat it. And look at the way she's put all the light, starts with the butter and then goes to the cheese, but she's showing off what Holland has, right? Holland makes cheese because they're a dairy nation, right? So the darkish green brown cheese is a very mature Edam, and the cream colored cheese is a Gouda. And the smallest cheese that's got the butter up on top of it is a ewe-based cheese. So, it's a goat cheese. So Dutch cheese was famous. They exported it as a source of natural pride. This is a Cotan, and he's a 17th century Spanish painter. And he does what's called the bodega, which is basically a pantry or food-based thing. Now, is this the way you store your cabbage and apples and melons and cucumber? No, it's not. But he was very, very interested in geometry and light and trompe-l'oeil effects. So you see the shadow that so it's the color and the light that takes you. He puts the apple and the cabbage, and see how much cabbage you've seen already. And you can bounce light off cabbage and then down to the melon. And then the light falls right on the melon and on the cucumber, which is going to fall off. Just fabulous. And he does it through scale and geometry and color against a background that's essentially nothing. This is an Adrian Court, another Flemish painter. And still life painting basically was his specialty. So what he's got here is this nice plum over on the right. and some asparagus. Now, remember, in Europe, they have more white asparagus than we do. And then you can see the gooseberries that are there, and then strawberries. And, you know, the problem with this is he can't just go to his own pantry and plop these here and have them be fresh vegetables and fruits, right? Because they don't ripen at the same time. So, you know, basically strawberries are June and gooseberries are in July and plums are in August, right? And asparagus is an early vegetable, but it's color. And again, do you see, using the shelf, the trompe-l'oeil effect, the pure black background, and then getting your eye to pop with just a little bit of light. Look at the white in the gooseberries, in the strawberries, and the light that's reflected off the already white asparagus. This is Manet. So hope you like asparagus. You're going to see a lot of asparagus. Manet did not do a lot of still life, but he did do some. And you're going to see a couple today. So this is just a bunch of asparagus. That's all it is. And all he's given you is some color contrast. So what are you supposed to look at here? You're supposed to look at the brushwork, right? And you can see he's seen Dutch still life, but he's made it very late 19th century. Okay. But if you pair him with a female artist that you may not know, and look what she does with asparagus. So I would ask you, which asparagus would you rather eat? All right. The answer is that the asparagus that Louise has done here is not only more realistic, but she's presented in it in such a way that you do want to eat it, you know, with the same color type artichokes, but against the strawberries, you know, and the fruit on the little table. And look at the plums, just fabulous here. She's even shown you what one of them looks like cut in two. Right? So she's taken a great deal of time to do a composition here. This is a true still life. Is the Manet a true still life? Well, yes, but not in the same way. So it's how you assemble the food that makes it appealing to the viewer. I mean, basically the Manet's is take it or leave it, right? In her case, there's more than that. This is Van Gogh's Potato Eaters. It's his first major work. And he was very interested in depicting people as they actually were. And so he painted a lot of working class people in, you know, especially before he moved to Arles. So he's in Holland here, and these are people who are extremely poor and basically ate a lot of potatoes because they grew them. But if it was a year the potatoes failed, then they were in trouble, right? He always considered this one of his finest paintings. And in fact, despite the fact that it never sold in his lifetime, there only one painting of his did, he thought it was one of his finest, and it's been stolen twice, right? Before it's, you know, came to the Van Gogh Museum. So a very dull palette, very drab living conditions, but he's humanized these people. He's given them, you know, a humanity that they probably wouldn't have in somebody else's painting. It's not so much the potatoes and the tea. It's the way he handles the light and the way he deals with them as a group. He's a very honest painter, a very spiritual painter. And you can even see this in 1885. This is an Italian painter, and it's a genre scene, so a direct observation of daily life, but it's kind of neat in terms of food. What's he eating? He's eating beans and onions. Now, in Baroque Italy, there were these thoughts about who could eat what, right? So, you know, simple people, poor people, who worked the land and so forth, were supposed to eat the food of the land. In other words, you ate a lot of beans and onions and that kind of thing. And they honestly thought that if these people tried to eat something really fancy like pheasant or something else, then they would get terribly, terribly sick. They had to stick to this diet, right? Beans especially, people said it should be eaten only by those who work hard. And of course, we know now beans are an excellent source of proteins and so forth for you, but it was considered lower class food in Italy in the 16th century. And of course, here we go. This is Andy Warhol, couldn't be more different, right? So he appropriates commercial products. And one of them was Campbell's soup, right? And he first showed this piece in 1962. And at that time, Campbell's sold 32 varieties, right? And so what you've got is all 32 varieties of the soup. They're exactly the same, except for where it says turkey vegetable or cream of asparagus, right? So otherwise, they're the same. And what Warhol said of this was, I used to eat it. I'd have the same lunch every day for 20 years, the same thing over and over again. Right? And that's exactly what he's painting. I hope you aren't so fond of Campbell's soup that I've turned you off of it. This is one of the greatest paintings of all time. Diego Velázquez is a Spanish Baroque painter who painted the humblest of subjects, the people in the streets. At this particular time in Spain, life was very difficult for the poor and the lower middle class. They had to eat very simply. Life was hand to mouth every day. And he's captured this on the street. So what you have here is a woman who makes a living by poaching eggs for people, right? And a boy who has a melon, but he's coming hoping that, and he's holding a bottle, hoping that she'll feed him, right? And people looked after each other because the government didn't. Because at this particular time, of course, the government is bankrupt and more interested in everything they could get out of South America. So look at not only the realism in this painting, but this is one of the great geniuses of all time in terms of painters. Look at the light-dark contrast. This is what's called chiaroscuro. And everything about it, look at the light reflections. Even something as simple as the onions. Every single object and individual painted in this gets the same amount of attention in terms of detail, color, light, texture. Look at the texture of the woman's bodice jacket. It's incredible, right? And is it about food? Yes. This is how the woman made a living. Right? But it's also beautifully composed. It's a circle, right? It's just like Clara Peters did to you. She's done the same thing. There's a reason why her left arm is positioned exactly where it is, because she's taken the egg that's in it, drawing your eye that way, and then up. Look at the whites, the beautiful shadows. Wonderful, wonderful painter. This is Frida Kahlo. And, I say, Frida Kahlo liked to paint Mexico, right? She's a Mexican, even though she has, her father certainly was German, but she very much absorbed the culture, the traditions of Mexico. She honored Mexico for what it was. So what you're looking at here is a still life of vegetables and fruits. Okay, some of them you recognize, and some of them you're probably struggling with. Okay, so you can pick out fruits like plums and vegetables like corn, right? And mushrooms. You can definitely see a couple of different kinds of mushrooms here. but perhaps you don't, you're curious about the kind of fuzzy looking ones that when they're an ovoid shape and they're got a sort of a green exterior, and when you cut it open, it's red inside. This is a pitahaya, and it's a dessert fruit, which sort of tastes like a melon, I guess. It grows on rocks and in thickets, and it has this beautiful flesh that paints very nicely here. And it has a lot of small black edible seeds. And as it happens, Frittacato love pitahayas because they're very sweet and juicy. This is an Osias bear, and it's a dessert still life. And of course, what he's showing off is, oh, look, I can paint reflections, whether they're in water or wine or whatever. So beautifully well done here. It's showing off the beautiful Chinese, what is called cracked porcelain bowls, which were imported, of course, from the East. So you have a bowl filled with strawberries and one filled with cherries. And the cherries are really well done. And so what you're doing, where are you in the painting? I always ask people. Well, the answer is you're standing on a ladder looking down at it, right? So it's a big bird's eye view, but what that allows you to do is see inside the bowls really well. It also exaggerates the proportion of the objects. And notice again the trompe l'oeil effect with the knife over the edge of the table and the light coming in from the left. And then you're a little bit upset here, probably because you're looking at it and you're saying, oh, don't they care that there's a fly there? They're bugs. Okay, well, these, in particular still life paintings, insects were used essentially as a symbolism. So in this, it's about a fight for man's soul, right? So when you look at it, when you look at the flies, well, they're competing for the man's soul with the butterfly, which is going to win, right? A butterfly is a symbol of resurrection. The dragonfly is a symbol of Satan. So it's okay for them to be on the table. People would have understand that. Flies are a creature of the evil, right? So sometimes when you look at this, it's not just about food, but he's also a very good painter. And the tabletop is as well done as the cherries. Here's another, and it's in a cracked porcelain bowl, of course. And what you're seeing here are basically citrus fruit and pomegranates. Pomegranates are frequently painted, not just because they're tasty and people had them, and they were fairly easy to get in the Mediterranean, but because, of course, they have these juicy red berries inside, right? I mean, they're wonderful. So they're the highlight of this. It wouldn't be the same without the pomegranate, right? So, this is wonderful 17th century, typical Dutch still life. It has a little more color than most, and it's because of the bowl and the vegetable or the fruits chosen. It's chosen for color. And you notice blue dominates. We haven't seen that so far. It hasn't been that much blue in it. Even in the background, the little bit of floral treatment, it's blue. And the background, just enough blue, right? To make this a lighter painting than most Dutch still life at this time. This is one that's in the Currier Museum in Manchester, where I spent an awful lot of time. So what you've got is an apricot, and some shells and a snail and a quince and a lot of very fine brushwork here. And then, because I warned you about it, you're seeing the snails and the butterfly, and the bugs. And remember, there are symbols here. They're not, you're not supposed to be upset that it isn't clean. And the tabletop is chipped. And that's because it's a vanitas, right? All things perish, and, better enjoy life while you can. The Dutch imported seashells from around the world. And so they were actually expensive. And so people would want them in the paintings to show that they could afford not only a cracked porcelain plate, but the shells. Today, yes, do we pick up shells if we go to the beach? Sure. But people paid big money for them back in Holland because they weren't going to go to the beach where they came from, right? But wonderful color. The grapes. There's a reason why there are grapes in so many paintings. It's because they're reflective. They have different surface textures to work with. This is a Cezanne, and he's considered one of the greatest masters of still life painting in the late 19th century. And this is probably his most celebrated. Now, say, compared to that, you're going, oh, where's the color? You like the painting. The composition is very interesting. Nobody paints tablecloth like Paul Cézanne, right? But it's what he's doing here is offering you a prelude here in food. You're saying, oh, pears. Yep. But notice they're pears in different stages of ripeness, right? So what are they really? Their color and their shape. And Paul Cézanne was the great precursor in many ways of Cubism. Okay, so now look at this painting and break it into shapes. And when you do that, you get this. See, this is Picasso. What's he done? Does that look yummy? Absolutely not. It's yummy turned to shape, right? So this is proto-cubism. Now you're looking at it and you're saying, it doesn't even make sense to me. I mean, I can see the food and the table, but what's all that other stuff? And that's Picasso with cubism using the background to let what's in the center of the picture drift to the corners. Curiously enough, this was meant to be a more conventional still life of food. And what you see is the green lines below the table. He originally had painted in people's legs there. So he originally had somebody sitting at this table, but then thought that they were distracting to what he was trying to do, so took them out. And you end up with a simple sort of proto-cubist type of painting that's about light, shadow, surface texture, volume, right? And the picture is flat, right? So there's not a lot of perspective in it. It's about color, it's about shape, and that's all it's about. You're not supposed to go for the pears in the bowl, right? They're not like those pears, but you can see where they came from. So now we're on dessert, and yes, oysters can be dessert. So in Dutch still life, you put everything in its own basket or container to present it here. So pretty interesting stuff. And what I want to concentrate in this is, of course, you see the seashells, and the reflective stuff that we've seen all along, but I want to talk about comfits, okay? Comfits were a type of candy sort of treat that the Dutch absolutely loved. So what it is, they are at the center of them, there's a seed or a nut that's edible, or a little teeny bit of a spice, right? And it's coated in sugar. And they're one of the earliest forms of candy ever. They probably came from the Middle East in the Middle Ages, but by the time they hit the Dutch in the 17th century, they turned into a dessert item. Okay. And you can see them in the center bowl there. First, you could either have a heavy sugar coating, which left kind of a smooth quality to it, or you could get even thicker, and when it dries, it's a rough or ragged appearance. So in the 17th century, the ragged comfits were the ones that were the most popular. And you see them a lot in still life paintings. So let's see if I can zero in on them here. So over to the left of the plate, you can see how rough that is. So, not good for you, of course. But, you also see, a tipped up wooden box, and that probably was candied quince jelly. And you've got figs in the background. And with it, some almonds and some raisins. And then, of course, the oyster, which was, not expensive. And here we have a flagel, and you see the mouse's back after another nut in this one. Remember, he's a symbol of death and destruction, so don't get too upset about seeing him there in terms of sanitation, right? And this is German still life. So you can see it's a little bit different, but he's trying to do the same thing as the Dutch, right? And there are comfits in this, so you can see the comfits right up close here. Is it realistic? Some of the figs are, right? Is the beetle too big? Yeah, it's too big. Proportion is not what he's looking for here. But, as much as you don't like it to be on the table with the food, the mouse is really quite well done. Here's another one of his. Now, this is the pretzel. Now, why such a big deal about the pretzel? Because during Lent, you could eat the pretzel because it didn't have dairy in it, right? So for dessert, you could have nuts and almonds and pretzels in a roamer where he's showing off the reflections. This is a Raphael Peale. You may know the painter Charles Wilson Peale, who is his father. And, he did a lot of these tightly grouped still lifes. He was not a happy person. And you can see it's not really a happy painting. All right. But what he's got are some cakes, which is a dessert item, and some fruit. And he's trying to do the same thing that the Dutch did, but he's not quite as successful. Why is that? Because the proportion is off, right? The goblet needs to be a little bit bigger here. He's trying to do some color contrast. He's trying to bring the light into the painting, but he's been too obvious about it, right? So actually, you're probably wondering, so why did you pick it if you're criticizing it? Because sometimes you can understand about paintings by showing an example that is not especially good, except that it's sold, it's the market, right? Who's your audience for this painting? Who's going to buy it? Middle-class Americans who live in eastern seacoast cities, right? They're not going to get a European painting. They're going to buy an American painting. And if your father is already well known, you can probably sell this dessert painting, okay? And where do American artists get their ideas? From European masters. He just didn't look hard enough, that's all. It's okay. I'm not saying it's a bad painting. It's just not a Clara Peters. This is a Monet. It's a fruit galette. Do you want to eat it? Probably not. It doesn't look very appetizing, doesn't it? And it's a Monet. He didn't do a lot of still lifes. He did a few. It's about brushwork. It's about light. It's about texture. It has a very limited palette, right? So it's a good painting, but it doesn't necessarily look like great food, right? And a wonderful still life with food does both of those things. And Claude is not doing that here. It's probably not stimulating your taste buds. Here's another Wayne Thiebaud. And you could, the temptation here is to put your forefinger out and scoop the frosting, isn't it? It's so well done that way. But look at how incredibly organized it is. And the shadow, which I've been talking about a lot, is what makes this painting. Take away the shadow and the cakes wouldn't be as effective, would they? So it's about geometry, it's about color, it's about shape, but it's also about food that you'd actually like to eat. So it's like a patisserie, and that's what Thiebaud does. He paints this kind of thing. And the last painting is by someone that I don't know whether you know. Janet Fish is, actually, I think she just died. She's a hyper-realist artist. And her big thing is reflection. And we've talked about it a lot today. So how do you get objects to reflect? So she paints an awful lot of glassware or things in plastic wrap because she's crazy about the ideas of reflection. So what she's done is to take the glass, you don't see what's in the glass, instead you see what's reflected from the magazine onto the glass. And probably the last thing you saw was cake, right? Because you were fascinated by the shapes and the reflections that she's doing. Look her up, she's fascinating as a painter. She can do, 3 peaches in market baskets, plastic wrap, styrofoam plate with plastic over it, and she makes them fascinating because she paints reflections as well as people like Clara Peters, right? And it's just, and she gives it what they don't, in some ways, in a sense of motion. She uses the reflection to give it motion. You can almost sense the magazine flopping open and doing that. Really great painter. And the last thing is the dessert plate, right? It's not the cake that's great about it. It's the fact that it's a clear glass dessert plate, as is the tea mug, and she's gotten the color reflections in it, and then popped a little bit onto the cake, but not much. So there you go. Food and art.
Well, thank you, Nancy. Let me take you off of Spotlight. And if people want to unmute themselves, we can have a discussion. If anybody had any questions for Nancy or comments.
Sally, I wondered where you were. I didn't see you earlier.
I was late. I got a closed caption telephone today, and I was mesmerized by all the gadgets. I would like to thank you for giving us such a layered presentation. We could learn about social class of people. We could learn about how you assemble the food and how this can affect one's appetite. We looked at food that looked pretty, but also some food that maybe would taste great. And we learned about the nationality of the painters. And there were so many women painters.
Oh, I do that on purpose.
I figured you did. I have a question. Janet Fish was 1996. Clara Peters, I didn't hear or remember her.
She's a 17th century Flemish painter.
17th century. Well, I certainly appreciated the inclusion of women because, of course, women have been overlooked in painting. And so I found it really fascinating all the way from sex of the cabbage to Picasso's geometry and color and shape. So I think the landscape was so broad and so layered. I really appreciated it.
No, thank you, Sally. Well, let me tell you about why I was able to pick female painters here. And think about it. Before the 20th century, women were extraordinarily fortunate if they got any formal art training at all. And if they did, it generally meant that their father was a painter and trained them, a girl along with her brothers, perhaps. Beginning in the late 19th century, women, say like Mary Cassatt, were able to get a formal art education, essentially by living a different kind of life. She was able to do that because, of course, she was from a wealthy family. But a painter, you know, it's the subject matter that you paint. So one thing about food paintings is you have to be careful that the food doesn't, of course, spoil before you finish painting it. But on the other hand, there it is, right? You don't have to get someone to sit for you. So why are there so few female portrait painters? Think about it. Who are they painting? Mostly men or women in expensive clothing with hats, right? So you'd get a few female portrait painters who paint primarily women, other women, right? You almost get no female history painters, right? Or landscape painters. Imagine going out on your own and painting. I mean, no chaperone. I mean, so think about it. So where is a safe subject? So there are a few painters like Clara Peters who got education because their father was a painter. And sometimes they marry another painter. Right. And then generally what happens is the production falls off because they end up having 6 kids. And a woman can't have a workshop. Why? Because a workshop employs men. Right. So I always try whenever possible to show you a few female artists who made it and whom the quality of their work is equal to or greater than a man's. So in other words, I mean, not to bash him again, but if you compare the Raphael Peale with the Louise Moulin, the lady with the asparagus, who's the better painter? Right? And even if I didn't tell you who painted it, you would know that, right? So I do it on purpose. There's so few of them. And then the greatest female painter of all time, in my opinion, is Artemisia Gentileschi, who basically said, after she'd been shafted by men, I'll paint what I like.
Well, I have a childhood memory of still life painting because my mother was an art, later in life went back to art school, which is what she'd always wanted to do. And she would be doing paintings. And if there was a bowl of fruit on the dining room table, we had to ask her if it was all right to eat any of the fruit or if it was the model for her painting.
Well, the really neat thing about oranges to paint, think about it in your own fruit basket at home, right? If you get an array, you've been to the market basket or the Hannafords, right? And you've bought your fruit for the week. Which piece of fruit is going to hang in there the longest on the exterior? Oranges, right? You know, where if you buy other, well, apples are pretty good too, but other fruit, bingo. I mean, the banana, you turn around and it's changed the way it looks. So the soft fruit is not going to last as long. So one of the reasons you get a lot of oranges is they provide color, texture, and they last longer.
Nancy,
Could you unmute yourself, Margaret?
unmute. I was a little girl and a neighbor brought me to a museum in Hartford, and I was mesmerized by the people made out of fruits. And I
Yeah.
love whenever you show that. I still like it as much today as I did as a little girl.
Mm-hmm. Yep. You probably went to the Hartford Athenaeum. Yeah.
Athenaeum.
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep. Yep. One of the great American art museums. Yeah. People should patronize it even more. Yes, Mary.
Nancy, I just want to express my deep gratitude. You really helped me look and see things in a new way and subtle ways. And I love the context of history that you offer. So anytime you come is a special occasion for me.
Oh,
Thank
that's
you
sweet. Thank
very
you.
much.
Well, what you're getting is somebody who spent her life teaching. You know, I'm not an art historian. I'm just someone who really loves art. And frankly, I love selling it to people. For years and years and years, I've been a docent at an art museum. And nothing gives me more delight than to stand with a group of 6 or 8 people in front of a painting and sell it to them, you know, and have them go away saying, oh, I'm going to come back and look at that one again in a few minutes. You know, I'll be up there on duty and wander up to a small group of people looking at a painting, just make a comment. If I don't get a good response, I walk away. If I get a response, it becomes a conversation about what they see, how they could see something else. You know, it's the educator in me. And I'm not, how to say this, I'm not overly serious about art. I am in one way, but I'm not in the other, you know. So that's part of it. I try to make art approachable to you. I don't make you feel, I don't ever want to make you feel less because you don't know about art. And I see that when people go to museums, they walk right by paintings because they don't know how to look at them. And you just have to have somebody teach you how to look at a painting. So that's what you got this morning. And you can do it with a painting of anything. And you don't have to be super serious about it. Partway through, when I made a comment, I thought to myself, oh dear, Nancy, you should have remembered this is being recorded. So hopefully, I hope that was okay. Because mostly I just talk.
That's part of what's so lovely.
Well, Nancy, thank you again for coming and for being our
Yes.
final.
Oh, you're muted.
I wanted to thank Nancy for coming and for being our final speaker for the year. And we do have another meeting in May, and that is the Alliance annual meeting. Due to sort of historic accident, the Alliance really has its own structure, sort of unique to any committee at First Church. And this year at the annual meeting, we not only need to elect Mary as our secretary, but we need to amend the bylaws to fit the way we now function on Zoom. And so you should look for an email that I'll be sending out in the next day or two, announcing the annual meeting and explaining a little bit about what it's going to be about. And that email will be from Fellowship One, which is our membership database system. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
Nancy,
you.
we'd love to see you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Nancy, I enjoyed this immensely. Thank you.
You're welcome.